All right, so if you guys remember the 2020 Democratic primary, then you will remember that basically the main selling point that the Democratic establishment was selling us to elect Joe Biden over Bernie Sanders was that Bernie Sanders would simply be called a radical socialist and he would never be able to get anything done, even if he was able to successfully win. And we simply need to go with the so-called moderate centrist Joe Biden, and he will be able to work across the aisle with Republicans to pass good legislation for the American people. And no way those radical socialist comments will be made by Republicans. Now, as we have seen over the entirety of the Joe Biden administration, none of that is actually true. He has been completely unable to work across the aisle with Republicans to pass anything good or meaningful on behalf of the American people. And on top of that, we still have people like Marco Rubio and the rest of the Republican Party still coming out and calling Joe Biden, who is basically a Mitt Romney moderate Republican, a so-called radical socialist. So here is Marco Rubio basically proving that the entire 2020 Democratic primary line was complete bullshit, as well as making some other stupid claims that we're going to get into here.
This is a Build Back Socialist plan, and it doesn't matter if it's $3.5 trillion or $1.75 trillion. At the end of the day, that's a gimmick because they can just lower the number of years. They can say, well, we're only going to have these socialist programs for 2 years, and that'll lower the cost because their plan is once they get these things in place, it's very hard to repeal them, and they know that. That's what they're banking on. So that's what he's coming up here to pitch and sell. And it's like everything else he does. It's always built around these fake artificial timelines that are for political purposes. We had to get out of Afghanistan by September 11th so he could have a press conference bragging about it. We saw that disaster. And now he has to come up with this plan to borrow and spend at least close to $2 trillion at a minimum, expand our government, codify socialism into the law. But he has to do it before he gets on a plane and flies to Europe, where the Chinese will hypocritically, talk about climate change while they're out there funding coal-fired plants all over the world and are the world's leading polluters. So par for the course.
That's right.
All right, so basically, that ending thing that he was just saying, that Joe Biden need to get his agenda passed before he goes off to Europe, they obviously did not successfully do that. Now, they're planning to vote, I think, tomorrow on both of these pieces of legislation, so we'll have to see on that. But then on top of that, I mean, there were so many points there that he made, which on the one hand were pretty enlightening in terms of him saying the quiet part out loud, but on another hand, were just completely laughably wrong. Okay, first of all, he brings up the fact that they could lower the amount of years that some of these programs were to, let's say, instead of 4 years or 10 years that you're funding these programs, you instead fund them for 2 years, thereby lowering the overall price tag of the bill while not actually gutting into some of the substance behind the policies that are within the bill. Now, that is a strategy that I was calling for. That's a strategy that most leftists were calling for, where if you have Joe Manchin or Kirsten Sinema or somebody else who has a problem with the $3.5 trillion number, then you say, okay, fine, we're going to do it over a shorter amount of time that will cut down the overall top line number that we are talking about while you keep the substance of the bill intact. Now, is that the strategy that Democrats actually went with? No, absolutely not. They just let basically both of these bills be completely gutted into oblivion, where now we're at the point where it's not even worth it for progressives to vote for this bill. They should be standing their ground and opposing the bill as it stands right now and demanding that better policies be included in it. And I'm going to give you guys a rundown in terms of how much this bill has actually been gutted, but that's point number one, is that strategy that he's talking about there. Democrats didn't even go with that strategy. And then the second point that he did, which was really saying the quiet part out loud, was he said it will make it significantly harder to undo a lot of these programs if Democrats successfully get them passed in the long term. Okay, that is saying the quiet part out loud for a Republican. Why? Because the reason why he's saying that, and he's correct in saying that, is the reason why it's harder to undo a lot of those policies is because they work and the overwhelming majority of the American people support them and desperately need them. A perfect example of this would be something like Social Security or something like Medicare and Medicaid, which are extremely hard for Republicans to cut, even though they constantly want to and talk about it even. It's really hard for them to cut those programs because these are programs that millions and millions of Americans rely on to maintain a stable life, okay? So it's very difficult to touch, especially when they're universal programs. It makes it even harder to touch them because a broad array of the American people are experiencing the material benefits from those policies. So he's 100% right, and that's evidence that Democrats should be more aggressive in implementing some of these universal long-term policies, because Republicans aren't going to dare go near those policies if the overwhelming majority of the American people are in support of them. So that's point number two. And then he also brought up the Afghanistan war, which is absolutely hilarious because as Marco Rubio would love for us to stay in Afghanistan, and he is simultaneously critiquing the fiscal responsibility of this current bill that actually invests in the American people, we just wasted trillions of dollars in these wars in the Middle East. America has spent $6.4 trillion on wars in the Middle East and Asia since 2001, a new study says. So this is even an underestimate based on other ones that I've seen in tandem with this, but $6.4 trillion over 2 decades to go towards basically completely fruitless wars that cause nothing but chaos and destruction and hurt us in the long run. And Marco Rubio is in full support of shit like this and continuing to stay in Afghanistan, wasting trillions of dollars, wasting countless lives of innocent civilians, Afghan civilians, Iraqi civilians, Syrian civilians, etc. All for what? To basically enrich his defense contractor buddies who are funneling money into his campaign in the forms of what really should be considered bribes. So it's just absolutely hilarious at face value that this guy is simultaneously saying we should be spending more money staying in Afghanistan for absolutely no justified reason at all, but we shouldn't be spending money investing in the American people in ways that are overwhelmingly popular and also desperately needed. But just to give you a reminder in terms of how gutted this bill has actually become, okay, it's completely ridiculous. So let's just start off here. What's actually still in the bill? Well, you still have the expanded child tax credit in some form, even though they were going to be making it permanent. Now it's only going to be for 1 year because apparently Democrats would love for children to fall back into poverty if Republicans win the 2022 midterm. So again, just completely ridiculous. They should have made it permanent. They didn't. So that's extended for 1 year. They're also doing a little bit of child care here, but also that's heavily means tested, so it's not going to be universally felt by the American people heading into 2022. You got universal pre-K. This is probably the best portion of the bill that is left within it. Okay, good. I 100% support that. Climate investments have basically all but been completely gutted from this bill, so you still have $550 billion over 10 years. So that's, less than 1/10 of what we were spending on our Pentagon budget every single year. So just completely ridiculous given that climate change is the single greatest threat facing humanity, and yet we're not even spending a tiny fraction of what we are spending on our military to tackle that issue. But healthcare coverage, again, just handouts to health insurance companies here, subsidizing the ACA, Obamacare, instead of actually addressing the main fundamental problem with our healthcare system, which is the for-profit nature, the privatization of our healthcare system. So instead of implementing something like a Medicare for all, or even the half-assed public option that Joe Biden promised and ran on, which he never talks about anymore, but still just doing subsidies to the ACA and subsidizing these for-profit health insurance companies instead of actually guaranteeing Americans healthcare, again, completely pathetic. Affordable housing was dramatically pared down, now only to $150 billion over 10 years. That's like $15 billion a year, roughly. Again, just a tiny fraction, given that we have hundreds of thousands of homeless people sleeping out on the streets in the richest country in the world. Tax changes, again, completely pathetic, barely half undoing some of the Trump tax cuts. Some of these are okay, right? The 15% minimum tax on corporate profits of large corporations, if that's actually implemented at 15%, it will be larger than what they are paying right now. So some of those are okay, but they don't go nearly far enough. And then what's not included at all, paid leave. We are the only developed country in the entire world that doesn't have paid leave, and they couldn't even get us 4 weeks or 12 weeks, which is significantly below the average of every country around the world. And so it's like all of these main policies that were the best and most popular portions of this bill were completely gutted. So they went from 12 weeks to 4 weeks. Now they're at 0 weeks. Also, Medicare dental and vision benefits are out because apparently old people don't need to be able to see or don't need to have their teeth in their mouth, as well as Medicare drug pricing negotiations, which is a 90% issue for the American people. They can't even pass something that is supported by 77% of Republicans, okay? Something that is desperately needed. We pay multiple times more than every other country in the entire developed world for our prescription drugs that we order here, and it's because our government doesn't even fucking negotiate with these companies like every other country around the world does. We just simply let them price gouge us out the ass and let them go along their merry way. But that's completely out. So again, completely pathetic. Free community college also cut completely from the version of the bill, and also the billionaire income tax, which literally would have only affected 700 people. Somehow, Democrats are protecting that constituency, overdoing what the overwhelming majority of the American people actually want. And just to give you a perspective on the bipartisan, even shittier, watered down bill, this is what they started with, okay? This was the original $2.6 billion, and then this is what bipartisanship gets you. So you go from that to this, okay? So crumbs, absolute crumbs are left in both of these bills, okay? They have both been eviscerated, watered down into oblivion, and again, I 100% stand by the fact these bills are not worth passing as they are right now. Progressives should hold the line, demand that better policies be included in this, or at the very least, if you're going to vote for this completely watered down, pathetic package because you're throwing your hands up in the air and you're saying, well, there's no way we'll be able to convince Sinema and Manchin to vote for them at all, then go straight to Joe Biden and say, if we are going to vote for both of these, I need you to legalize marijuana right now, okay? By executive executive order. I need you to do all of the host of other number of things you could do by executive order. Completely cancel student loan debt. They have some leverage over Joe Biden, even if they don't have leverage over Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema directly. Make demands. Actually make concrete policy demands. If Biden legalized marijuana and cut student loan debt, completely got rid of student loan debt in this country, Democrats would sweep in 2022. And yet they're not even going to touch on, and not only the policies that were cut out of these extremely previously popular bills, but they're not even going to tackle the executive order side of what Biden can do. So not even using a fraction of their power. And yet we still have Republicans coming out and saying that Joe Biden is a radical socialist. Okay. It's just completely laughable. So the Republican establishment is wrong and misidentifying the current situation and what the American people want. The Democratic establishment is still fearful of being called radical socialists, even though, again, Republicans are going to be saying that no matter what you do, so you might as well pass good policies that materially improve the lives of the American people, and then don't worry about the actual messaging that Republicans are launching. It's just a completely pathetic, ridiculous situation. And yet it seems like Democrats are going to pass both of these completely watered down and hollow bills and get ready to get completely eviscerated in 2022.